At dinner, my dad looked straight at me and said, "Go live in the streets." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. He said it clearly, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. My mother froze. My brother stared at his plate. No one defended me. And me? I smiled, because none of them knew the truth. They didn't know I had built my life quietly, far away from their approval. They didn't know I ran companies they'd never understand. They didn't know I earned $27 million a year. So I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I stood up, thanked them for dinner, and walked away. They thought that was the end of it. They thought I'd disappear. But 3 weeks later, they were standing on the other side of a door they never expected to knock on. And that's when everything changed. My name is Sophia. I'm 32 years old now, but in my family, age never changed anything. Roles were assigned early, and once you were placed into one, you stayed there. My father, Richard, was the unquestioned authority. His word didn't need volume. Silence was enough. When he entered a room, conversations adjusted themselves automatically, like furniture being pushed closer to the walls. My mother, Margaret, survived by smoothing things over. She believed harmony was more important than truth. Whenever tension rose, she would smile tightly and say, "Let's not make this a big deal," even when it already was. My younger brother, Ethan, was the future, the one with potential, the one who needed protecting. And me? I was the complication. Not the rebel, not the failure. Just inconvenient. From the time I was a child, I sensed it. When relatives came over, Ethan was asked about school, sports, plans. I was asked if I was still into that phase. Whatever phase they meant, it always sounded temporary, like they were waiting for me to outgrow myself. When I spoke too confidently, my father would glance at me and say, "You don't need to sound so sure, Sophia." When I questioned something that didn't make sense, he'd sigh. "You always make things harder than they need to be." Harder for him. At dinner, I learned to speak last. Sometimes not at all. If Ethan struggled, my parents leaned in. "He's under pressure," my mother would whisper. "He just needs support," my father would add. If I struggled, the response was different. "You're independent," my mother liked to say, smiling at guests. "You've always been independent." It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It meant don't ask us for help. By the time I was a teenager, I stopped bringing my achievements home. Not because I wasn't proud, but because pride made them uncomfortable. Success from me disrupted the balance. It blurred the lines they had drawn so carefully. Once, after I won a regional academic competition, I overheard my aunt say, "Well, she is smart, but you know how she is." I never found out what that meant exactly. I just knew it was something that required an explanation. At family gatherings, I became background noise. Conversations moved around me like water around a stone. Present, but never central. "She's still figuring herself out," my mother would say if someone asked what I was doing. My father rarely answered at all. Silence was his way of correcting expectations. And slowly, I understood the rule. Love in our family wasn't unconditional. It was earned through compliance. By the time I left home, I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of shrinking. Tired of translating myself into something easier to digest. Tired of carrying a version of myself that existed only to keep others comfortable. When I moved away, my father shook my hand and said, "Just don't embarrass us." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because explaining myself had never changed anything before. What I didn't know then, what none of them knew, was that walking away from that house wasn't the beginning of my distance from them. It was the first time I chose not to play the role they gave me, and that choice would cost all of us more than they ever imagined. The dinner was supposed to be simple. That was what my mother said when she called earlier that day. "Just family," she told me. "Nothing formal, nothing stressful." I almost didn't go. Something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. But skipping dinner would only confirm the story they already liked to tell, that I was distant, difficult, ungrateful. So I went. My parents' house hadn't changed much since I moved out. Same driveway. Same front door that always closed a little too loudly. Same living room arranged for appearances rather than comfort. The dining table was set carefully. Candles. Matching plates. My mother's version of control. My father sat at the head of the table, as always. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He rarely did at first. A subtle reminder of hierarchy. Sophia, my mother said, forcing a smile. You made it, I nodded. Of course. My brother, Ethan, gave me a quick glance before looking away. He never knew where to place himself when things got tense. That wasn't his role. Dinner started quietly. Small talk, weather, someone's new car. My mother filled the gaps like she always did, afraid silence might turn into something dangerous. I answered questions politely but briefly. I'd learned that too much detail invited interrogation. Too little made me look evasive. There was no perfect balance, just damage control. Halfway through the meal, my father leaned back in his chair. It wasn't sudden. It was deliberate. So, he said, swirling his drink slowly, what's new with you, Sophia? The question wasn't curiosity. It was a setup. I felt it immediately. The way the table went still. The way my mother's hand tightened around her fork. I've been busy, I said evenly. Busy doing what? He pressed. I met his eyes. Calm. Neutral. Work? He smiled then, but not kindly. Still bouncing around? He asked. Trying things out? There it was. The version of me he preferred. Unstable, temporary, incomplete. I'm doing fine, I said. My mother jumped in quickly. She's always been independent, she said, her voice light. You know, Sophia. My father didn't look at her. He was watching me now, studying my face like he was measuring something invisible. Fine, he repeated slowly. At your age, fine isn't exactly impressive. No one spoke. I felt the familiar pressure years of conditioning telling me to soften, to explain, to earn my place back at the table. But something inside me stayed still. I'm comfortable with my life, I said. That was when his expression changed. Not anger. Not frustration. Dismissal. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the moment feel heavier. Well, he said, if you're still figuring things out and refusing help, maybe you should consider what real independence looks like. My mother froze. I didn't move. Because honestly, he continued, his voice calm and sharp at the same time, if you can't get your life together by now, maybe you should go live in the streets. The words landed quietly. No yelling. No dramatic pause. Just a statement. A verdict. For a second, no one breathed. My mother stared at the table like it had betrayed her. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. And I realized something then. This wasn't impulsive. He'd been holding on to that sentence. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for witnesses. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No heat in my chest. No sting behind my eyes. Just clarity. This was how he saw me. This was how they all saw me. And suddenly, it didn't hurt anymore. It simplified everything. I smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because I agreed. Because arguing would only feed the story they wanted. I set my napkin down carefully. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. My mother looked up, startled. Sophia. I stood. My father watched me, his expression unreadable. I think he expected me to break, or defend myself, or beg. I did none of those things. I walked to the door, paused just long enough to grab my coat, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The door closed behind me with a soft click. And in that moment, standing alone on the porch, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. I hadn't just been dismissed. I had been released. 3 days after the dinner, the silence settled in. Not the awkward kind, the heavy, stretching kind that follows a final decision. I stood in my apartment in Austin, barefoot on polished concrete floors, watching the city wake up below my windows. Morning traffic moved like a quiet current, steady and purposeful. The world didn't feel broken. It felt normal. That was the strange part. According to my family, I was unstable, lost, on the edge of failure. Yet here I was, reviewing contracts before sunrise, preparing for a board meeting at 9, and finalizing a product launch that had been 6 months in the making. This was the life they never asked about. The apartment was minimalist by design, not because I couldn't afford more, but because I valued space. Clean lines. Quiet. Control. Every piece of furniture had been chosen deliberately, paid for with money I earned, contracts I signed, risks I carried alone. I poured myself coffee and opened my laptop. Inbox, full. Calendar, packed. I was the CEO of 2 companies employing over 100 people combined. Engineers, designers, analysts, People who trusted my judgment and relied on my leadership. None of them knew what had happened at that dinner. And I liked it that way. Work had always been my refuge, not from responsibility, but from judgment. In my world, results mattered more than perception. Either you delivered, or you didn't. There was no room for rewriting the narrative to protect someone's pride. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. Rachel. I hesitated before answering. I already sensed why she was calling. Soph, she said softly. I just wanted to check on you. I'm fine, I replied. A pause. You sure? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline. I've never been better. She exhaled, like she'd been holding something in. I didn't think it was right, what your dad said. None of us did. None of us did, but none of you spoke, I thought. Instead, I asked, why now? Another pause. Because your mom's been talking, Rachel admitted. Telling people you're not doing well, that you're struggling financially. I laughed quietly, not loudly, not bitterly. Just a soft sound of recognition. She told people at church you might be staying with friends, Rachel continued, that you don't really have stable housing. I closed my eyes. They hadn't just dismissed me, they'd erased me. I see, I said. I know it's not true, Rachel rushed to add. I just thought you should know what they're saying. I thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment, I didn't move. The story they were telling wasn't accidental. It wasn't confusion. It was protection. Because if I was failing, then my father's words at dinner were justified. If I was unstable, then their behavior was concern. If I was dependent, then they were still in control. Truth was dangerous to them. That afternoon, between meetings, I caught myself thinking about how little they actually knew. They didn't know about the nights I slept in my office during my first startup's launch. They didn't know about the investors who laughed before they signed. They didn't know about the risks I took when failure meant personal bankruptcy. They also didn't know my income. Not because I hid it deliberately, but because they never earned the right to know. Last year, my total earnings crossed $27 million. Not overnight, not through luck, through years of consistent growth, strategic exits, and relentless focus. And still, in their version of reality, I was figuring things out. By evening, another message came in from Rachel. There's something else, she wrote. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What? I typed back. Your parents are trying to help Ethan, she said. They mentioned funding options. Loans. They're worried his business isn't doing well. Funding options. In my family, that phrase always meant the same thing. It meant finding someone else to absorb the risk. And suddenly, memories clicked into place. My father asking for copies of my old documents just in case. My mother wanting my signature on routine paperwork. Years ago. Their sudden confidence that things would work out. A cold realization settled over me. They hadn't just pushed me out. They were still reaching for me quietly, strategically assuming I wouldn't notice. Or worse, assuming I wouldn't fight back. I stared at my phone, the city lights flickering on outside my windows, and for the first time since the dinner, I felt something rise in my chest. Not fear. Resolve. They had told a story where I was weak. They had built plans that depended on that lie. And soon, they were going to learn the difference between the daughter they dismissed and the woman they never prepared for. The email arrived on a Monday morning. It didn't look dramatic. No red flags. No alarming language. Just a subject line sitting quietly at the top of my inbox. Verification required. Guarantor authorization. I almost ignored it. I was between meetings, scanning messages the way you do when your mind is already 5 steps ahead. But something about the sender made me pause, a law firm name I recognized but couldn't immediately place. Curiosity tugged harder than caution. I clicked. The first paragraph was polite, professional, neutral to the point of numbness. This notice is to confirm your status as financial guarantor on the business loan approved in 2021. I stopped reading. Guarantor? I scrolled back up, checking the name again. Sophia Reynolds. My name. I felt a strange hollowing in my chest, like the air had quietly left the room without asking permission. I kept reading. Loan amount. $610,000. Purpose. Business expansion. Primary borrower. Ethan Reynolds. My brother. My fingers went cold. The email explained that the loan had entered a review phase due to missed benchmarks. Nothing dramatic yet. Just routine verification. Routine. Attached was a PDF. I hesitated for exactly 1 second before opening it. The document looked official. Clean margins, stamped dates, pages of terms and signatures. My eyes moved quickly, scanning for what I hoped wouldn't be there. Then I saw it. My name. My signature. Except it wasn't mine. Not really. It was close enough to pass at a glance, but wrong in the details. The curve of the S was too sharp. The spacing between my first and last name was off. Whoever signed it knew what my signature looked like, but not how it felt. Someone had studied it. Someone had practiced. I closed the file and sat back in my chair, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to do when panic tried to slip in unnoticed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't sloppy paperwork. This was fraud. And the people who had access to my documents, my real signature, were very limited. I didn't want to believe it. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Tried to imagine a scenario where this had happened without intention. But the truth pressed in from all sides. My parents had pushed me out of the family narrative. They had told people I was unstable. They had painted me as dependent. And now, quietly, legally, they had used my name. I picked up my phone and called the number at the bottom of the email. A woman answered, her voice calm and practiced. "Thank you for calling. How can I help you?" "My name is Sophia Reynolds," I said. "I'm calling about a guarantor verification notice." There was a pause as she pulled up the file. "Yes," she said. "We just need to confirm your authorization on the loan." "I didn't authorize it," I replied. Silence. Then, gently, "Are you saying the signature was used without your consent?" "Yes." She didn't sound surprised. "That does happen," she said carefully, "more often than people realize." That sentence settled heavily. She explained the process: documentation, formal dispute, authentication review, possible escalation. Her voice softened when she added, "You should contact your attorney as soon as possible." I thanked her and ended the call. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. This wasn't just about money. It was about identity. They hadn't asked for help. They hadn't even told me. They had assumed I wouldn't notice, or that I wouldn't fight. I called Daniel Harris, my attorney, immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Sophia," he said, "you don't usually call like this." "I think someone forged my signature on a $600,000 loan," I said. There was a pause, not confusion. "Focus. Send me everything," he replied. Now. 10 minutes later, we were on a video call. Documents open, screens shared. His expression tightened as he reviewed each page. "This wasn't accidental," he said finally. "They did their homework." My stomach twisted. "Legally," he continued, "this is serious. Identity misuse, financial fraud, potential criminal implications." Criminal. The word echoed louder than I expected. "I don't want to destroy anyone," I said quietly. Daniel looked at me carefully. "I know, but protecting yourself isn't destruction." He explained my options. I could file a fraud claim immediately and distance myself entirely from the loan. Or, if the loan defaults, he said slowly, you could assume control of the debt strategically. I frowned. "Control?" "Yes," he replied. "The asset tied to the loan. You could turn this into leverage instead of damage." I leaned back, absorbing the shift. They had tried to use me as a shield, to hide risk behind my name. And now, that same move could expose them. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Your decision," Daniel said. "Once we start, there's no pretending this didn't happen." I thought of the dinner, of my father's calm voice telling me to live in the streets, of my mother folding shame into silence, of the story they told the world about me afterward. They hadn't just crossed a boundary, they had erased it. "Proceed," I said. Daniel nodded. "Then we begin tonight." After the call ended, I stood and walked to the window. The city stretched endlessly in front of me, solid, real, built on effort and accountability. They thought I was weak. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. For the first time, I wasn't walking away. I was standing exactly where the truth could reach them. Once the decision was made, everything moved quickly. Not emotionally, procedurally. Daniel was clear about one thing from the beginning. If we were going to do this, We would do it cleanly. No threats, no confrontations, no dramatic accusations. Everything would be documented, traceable, and precise. That was the part my parents had never understood about power. Real power doesn't shout, it files paperwork. Within 24 hours, Daniel's team began gathering records, loan agreements, timestamps, communication logs, signature authentication reports. Every file told the same quiet story: intent. Someone had shown up in person to finalize the loan. Someone had presented identification. Someone had rehearsed my signature until it looked believable enough to pass. This wasn't rushed, Daniel said during one of our calls. They planned this. I believed him. Because planning was something my family respected. They didn't act emotionally when money was involved. They acted strategically. And strategy, when exposed, leaves a trail. 3 days after Thanksgiving, while my parents were likely telling relatives that I was finding myself, Daniel filed the formal notice disputing the guarantor authorization. At the same time, quietly, deliberately, we began preparing for the alternative outcome. The loan was already unstable. Ethan's business had missed multiple revenue benchmarks. Cash flow projections were optimistic at best, fictional at worst. The lender had tolerated delays because of one thing: my name, my creditworthiness, my financial stability, my reputation. Without my silent backing, the numbers collapsed. Daniel explained the plan carefully. If the loan defaults, he said, you can step in as the acquiring party. You won't be rescuing them. You'll be controlling the asset. Control, not revenge, not punishment. Control meant boundaries. It meant they could no longer use my identity as a safety net while pretending I didn't exist. I spent evenings reviewing spreadsheets instead of reliving the dinner in my head. Numbers were grounding, predictable, honest. The boutique Ethan's pride and my parents' favorite talking point was hemorrhaging money. Expansion plans had been funded entirely by the loan I never signed. Without continued lender confidence, it would collapse quickly. And collapse was exactly what began to happen. A week later, Daniel called me in the early evening. The lender has flagged the loan, he said. They're concerned. Concerned enough to act? I asked. Concerned enough to stop pretending. I nodded slowly. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. You didn't hear this from me, she wrote. But your parents are stressed. Really stressed. I stared at the screen. What about? I typed. A moment passed. The loan, she replied. They didn't think it would move this fast. Of course they didn't. They had built their plan on the assumption that I would remain invisible. 2 days later, another message arrived, this time from an unfamiliar number. Ethan. I hadn't heard from my brother since the dinner. Soph, the text read. Can we talk? I didn't respond immediately. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. When someone reaches out only when the ground beneath them shifts, it's rarely about reconciliation. Eventually, I replied. About what? A pause. Things are complicated right now, he wrote. Mom and Dad are worried. I imagined them at the kitchen table, voices low, control slipping. For the first time, the narrative wasn't obeying them. I'm sure they are, I replied. Soph, he wrote again. We're family. I closed my eyes. Family had always been the word they used when they needed something. I'm handling things through my attorney, I typed. That's the appropriate channel. There was no response after that. By the second week, the situation escalated. The lender issued a preliminary notice. No accusations, no drama, just facts. Missed benchmarks, unstable projections, review underway. Daniel called me the moment it happened. They're panicking, he said. But they still think this can be smoothed over. Do they know it's me? I asked. No, he replied. And that's important. Important because illusions are strongest right before they break. A few days later, I received another message, this time from Mark, my mother's brother. Sophia, he wrote, your parents are under a lot of pressure. Maybe you could help calm things down. Calm things down. I stared at the phrase. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask if I'd been hurt. They asked me to stabilize the situation for them. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the message to Daniel. He replied with a single line. This is exactly why we're doing this the right way. By the end of the second week, the loan slipped into default. No explosion. No dramatic announcement. Just a quiet legal transition. Daniel called me that Friday morning. "It's official," he said. "You now control the debt and the asset attached to it." I sat down slowly, absorbing the words. Control didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my family's decisions. I was setting the terms. "They're going to want to meet," Daniel added. "I know," I said. "How would you like to proceed?" he asked. I thought back to the dinner, to the way my father delivered his words like a verdict, to the silence that followed. "On neutral ground," I said. "With you present." Daniel agreed immediately. "That's wise." That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Ethan calling. I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, a text appeared. "They got a notice today," he wrote. "They think the lender wants to negotiate." I exhaled slowly. "They do," I typed back. He didn't know what that meant yet. Neither did my parents. But they would. Very soon. Because the story they had told about who I was, what I needed, how small I should remain was about to collapse under the weight of its own lies. And this time, I wasn't walking away quietly. I was walking in on my terms. We met on a Friday evening. Not at my parents' house. Not at mine. Neutral ground. A quiet restaurant in downtown Dallas. Polished wood floors, low lighting, the kind of place where conversation stayed contained, where voices didn't need to rise to carry weight. Daniel arrived first, calm, prepared, a thick folder resting beside his glass of water. When I walked in, he stood briefly and nodded. No words. Everything had already been said. A few minutes later, they arrived. My mother entered first, posture straight, lipstick perfect. Her face held the practiced expression she wore when something was wrong but still salvageable. My father followed, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room like he was looking for leverage. Ethan came last. He looked smaller than I remembered. They sat down without greeting me. That didn't surprise me. My mother broke the silence. "Sophia," she said gently, "thank you for arranging this. We've been under a lot of stress." "Of course you have," I thought. My father leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We were told the lender wanted to discuss options," he said. "We're prepared to be reasonable." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He waited. Then he spoke. "I'm not the lender's attorney," he said evenly. My father frowned. "Then why are you here?" Daniel placed the folder on the table and slid it forward. "I represent Sophia," he said. "She is now the acquiring party on the loan." The air changed. My mother blinked rapidly. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. My father went still completely still in a way I'd only seen once or twice before. "What does that mean?" my mother asked. Daniel didn't rush. "It means," he said, "that the debt associated with the loan is now under Sophia's control, along with the asset tied to it." My father's voice came out hoarse. "You bought our loan?" I met his eyes. "You put my name on it," I said. "I reclaimed it." Silence pressed down on the table. My mother shook her head slowly. "Sophia," she said, her voice trembling, "we only did that because Ethan needed help. We thought you'd understand." "Understand?" The word tasted bitter. "You forged my signature," I replied calmly. "That's not help." Ethan finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't need the money." I turned to him. "You're right," I said. "I don't need the money. I need my name." My father's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "This is family," he said sharply. "You don't handle family through lawyers." Daniel spoke before I could. "Family doesn't authorize financial obligations without consent," he said. "That's not a personal disagreement. That's a legal violation." My mother's eyes filled with tears, not remorseful tears, fearful ones. "We raised you," she said. "How can you do this to us?" I leaned forward slightly. "The night you told me to go live in the streets," I said, my voice steady. "You taught me exactly how you handle family." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he didn't have a prepared response. Daniel slid another document onto the table. "You have two options," he said calmly. 1. Sell the asset voluntarily, resolve the debt entirely, and walk away clean. He paused. 2. Sophia assumes ownership and you remain involved only under a structured, legally binding agreement. No control. No guarantees. Ethan stared at the paper like it might explode. My father looked at me, disbelief flickering across his face. You're forcing us to rent our own business? I didn't flinch. It isn't yours, I said. Not anymore. My mother let out a soft sound, half gasp, half sob. This is cruel, she whispered. I shook my head. No, I said. This is accountability. Ethan slammed his hand lightly against the table, not violently, just frustrated. You could have just talked to us, he said. I met his gaze. I tried, I replied. For years. My father leaned back slowly, like the weight of the moment was finally settling in. What do you want? He asked. The old question. The one he'd used my entire life, assuming the answer was obedience. Nothing, I said. Not apologies, not gratitude. I paused. Just boundaries. Daniel closed the folder with a soft sound. You have 7 days to decide, he said. We recommend you consult independent counsel. No one argued. No one shouted. Because there was nothing left to negotiate. The illusion they had built, the one where I was dependent, unstable, small, had collapsed quietly, right there between polished plates and untouched glasses. When they stood to leave, they didn't look at me. My mother's shoulders were slumped. My father's steps were slower than I'd ever seen them. Ethan hesitated at the doorway. Soph, he said quietly. I didn't think it would come to this. I nodded. Neither did I said. But it did. The door closed behind them. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something deeper. Relief. For the first time, the truth had been spoken out loud, witnessed, documented. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged. I hadn't shrunk. Daniel looked at me after a moment. You handled that well, he said. I exhaled slowly. I didn't do it for them, I replied. I did it so I could finally hear myself think. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent and alive. 3 weeks ago, my father told me to live in the streets. Tonight, he walked away knowing exactly who owned the ground beneath him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't wonder if I'd gone too far. I knew I'd finally gone far enough. The days after the meeting were quieter than I expected. No angry calls, no dramatic messages. No attempts to rewrite the story, at least not to my face. Silence settled in again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't threatening, it felt final. Daniel kept me updated every morning. Short emails. Clean language. No emotion. Day 1. They requested additional documents. Day 3. They consulted outside counsel. Day 5. They asked about extensions. None were granted. I didn't celebrate. I didn't pace my apartment waiting for updates. I went to work. I led meetings. I made decisions that affected hundreds of people who had nothing to do with my family drama. That, more than anything, reminded me how small my parents' world had always been. On the 6th day, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Yes? I said. They're thinking about selling, he said quietly. The whole thing. I closed my eyes. Not in relief. In acceptance. That would resolve the debt, I replied. I know, he said. I just wanted you to hear it from me. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Uncertainty. For most of his life, decisions had been made around him. For him. Consequences softened. Edges filed down. Now, there was nowhere to hide. They're scared, he added. I didn't respond right away. They were scared the night they told me to live in the streets? I asked finally. He didn't answer. I'm not trying to punish anyone, I said. I'm protecting myself. I know, he whispered. The call ended without resolution. On the 7th morning at 9:14 a.m., Daniel's email arrived. They've chosen to sell. That was it. No flourish. No explanation. Just a decision made too late to preserve pride, but early enough to avoid complete collapse. Selling the asset cleared the debt in full. My name would be released from every obligation. Clean, final, irreversible. I sat at my desk for a long moment, staring at the city beyond the glass. 3 weeks earlier, my father had looked me in the eye and told me to go live in the streets. Now, the business they'd built their image around was gone. I didn't feel victory. I felt oxygen. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. They made the right choice, he said, legally speaking. Thank you, I replied. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about the question carefully. Yes, I said. I really am. 2 weeks later, Ethan's company officially shut down. The announcement appeared online in soft language and pastel colors. Sometimes chapters close so new ones can begin. No mention of debt, no accountability, just a curated ending. But the comments told a different story. What happened? Didn't they just expand? I heard there were financial issues. The illusion was cracking in public now. My parents retreated quietly. No more hosting. No more carefully staged family photos. No more subtle reminders of status. They sold their house and moved into a smaller rental across town. Not ruined, not destitute, just ordinary. Rachel texted me one evening. They're different, she wrote. Quieter. I pictured my father sitting at a table without an audience. My mother without something to smooth over. Are they angry? I asked. I think they're ashamed, Rachel replied. But more than that, they're confused. Confused because the story they told themselves for decades had ended. They had believed authority was permanent, that family hierarchy was immune to consequence, that control, once established, could never be challenged. They were wrong. And for the first time, they couldn't rewrite it away. One night, as winter settled over the city, I walked along the river near my apartment. The air was cold, sharp enough to clear my head. The skyline reflected in the water, steady and real. I realized something then. I hadn't destroyed my family. They had built their world on assumptions that couldn't survive reality. All I did was stop carrying the weight of their denial. I used to think closure would feel like an apology, or recognition, or remorse. It didn't. Closure felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to exist without bracing for judgment. I no longer checked my phone, hoping or dreading to see their names. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head that would never happen. I had stepped out of the role they assigned me. And the strangest part? The world didn't fall apart when I did. It got quieter. And in that quiet, I finally understood what freedom actually felt like. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No dramatic apology. No last-minute confession. No emotional reunion designed to tie everything back into a neat ending. Life simply continued. And for the first time, it continued without the constant background noise of needing to be understood by people who never wanted to understand me. My days returned to their rhythm. Morning meetings, strategy calls, quiet lunches at my desk while reviewing plans for the next quarter. Work didn't distract me from what happened. It grounded me. It reminded me that I was capable, trusted, and respected in a world built on accountability rather than hierarchy. I started sleeping better. Not longer, deeper. The kind of sleep that comes when your mind isn't rehearsing defenses or reliving conversations that ended years ago. One evening, while standing on my balcony with a cup of tea, I thought about my parents for the first time without tension tightening my chest. Not with anger, not even sadness, just clarity. They had spent their lives believing control was love, that authority was protection, that family loyalty meant obedience. I had spent mine trying to fit inside that belief. Letting go didn't feel like rejection. It felt like honesty. I didn't reach out to them. They didn't reach out to me. And that silence, once frightening, became peaceful. A month later, I launched a mentorship program through one of my companies. It wasn't something I announced loudly. It didn't come with press releases or polished speeches. It was small by design. Young women in tech. Founders who came from environments where support was conditional. People who had been told, in subtle ways, that their ambition was inconvenient. I recognized the look in their eyes immediately. The quiet determination mixed with self-doubt. The habit of over-explaining. The instinct to shrink just enough to stay safe. I didn't tell them my story in full. I didn't need to. I showed them what boundaries looked like. What documentation looked like. What choosing yourself calmly, legally, deliberately actually meant. And something inside me softened. Not because I had fixed the past, but because I was finally building forward without dragging it behind me. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through Rachel. My father worked part-time now. My mother volunteered at a community center. They lived quieter lives. Smaller. More real. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt distance. And distance, I learned, can be a form of mercy. One night, as I walked home along the river, city lights reflecting across the water, I stopped and listened to the hum of traffic. the distant laughter of people passing by. This was the life I chose. Not the one I escaped. Not the one I was pushed out of. The one I built. My parents once told people I was unstable, that I didn't have solid ground beneath me. In a way, they were right. I had been standing on expectations that were never meant to hold me. Letting them collapse wasn't destruction. It was construction. Here's what I know now. You don't owe access to people who misuse your trust. You don't owe silence to those who harm you quietly. And you don't need permission to protect your name, your work, or your future. Walking away isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest legal, emotional, and personal boundary you'll ever set. 3 weeks after my father told me to live in the streets, he learned something he never expected. I didn't need his approval to stand. I already owned my ground. And this time, I wasn't leaving it.